The year is 1201. A woman is crossing the Pyrenees in winter. She is 79 years old. The passes are frozen. The wind comes down from the peaks with the kind of cold that makes younger travelers turn back and call it wisdom. She does not turn back. Her name is Eleanor of Aquitaine. She has been Queen of France. She has been Queen of England. She spent nearly 16 years as a prisoner in her own kingdom. She has outlived 2 husbands and 4 of her 10 children. She has watched empires she helped build begin to crack at the edges, and she is crossing the Pyrenees in winter because the dynasty needs something only she can do. There is a marriage to arrange, a diplomatic crisis to prevent, a granddaughter to evaluate in person. Because Eleanor trusts her own judgment more than any report a messenger can carry. She is going herself, because that is what she has always done. Gone herself. When the thing matters enough, 79 years old, the mountains frozen, still working. Here is the question her life forces us to ask. Eleanor of Aquitaine never held a throne of her own. Every crown she wore belonged legally to the man beside her. Every decision she made passed through systems built to contain her. Every time the world tried to erase her, something brought her back to the center of events. What was that thing? What did she hold that was harder to take away than a throne? Harder to name than power? That is what this story is about. It begins not in a palace, but on a road in southern France. The year is 1137. A man is dying, and he is about to make his daughter the most dangerous woman in Europe. Guillaume X, Duke of Aquitaine, died in April of 1137 on a pilgrimage road in northern Spain, a few miles short of the shrine of Santiago de Compostela. He was 42 years old. He had no sons. What he had was land. Aquitaine, in the 12th century, was not simply a region on a map. It was a world. It stretched from the Loire River in the north to the Pyrenees in the south, from the Atlantic coast deep into the heart of what is now southern France. It contained Poitiers and Bordeaux and the rich wine country of the Garonne Valley. It held ports and rivers and agricultural wealth that made other rulers quietly recalculate their ambitions every time they looked south. In terms of raw territory, Aquitaine was larger than the land the King of France actually controlled. Not nominally controlled, actually controlled. A Duke of Aquitaine was, in practice, more powerful than the monarch he technically served. Guillaume X understood exactly what he was leaving behind. He spent his final days on that road, arranging what he could. He sent word north to King Louis VI of France, placing his daughters under royal protection and suggesting a marriage between his eldest daughter and the king's son. It was the most responsible thing a father in his position could do. It was also the moment Eleanor stopped being a person and became a problem to be solved. She was 15 years old. Think about what that meant in practice. A young woman holding that much land in the 12th century was not powerful in the way a young man holding the same land was powerful. A duke with land was a lord. A duchess with land was a vacancy. An inheritance without a male guardian was, in the legal and political vocabulary of the time, an open invitation. The system did not require anyone to be cruel. It simply operated according to its own logic. And its logic said that land held by a woman alone was land waiting to be claimed. Within days of Guillaume's death, the roads leading toward Aquitaine were busy. Several ambitious lords understood immediately what the news from Santiago de Compostela meant. They were not coming to offer condolences. They were coming because this was how the system worked. and they were men who had spent their lives learning to move quickly when the system offered an opening. Imagine the world Eleanor stepped into in those weeks. 15 years old, her father not yet buried, and the most powerful men in France already calculating what her existence meant for their futures. She had not done anything to earn this attention. She had simply been born the eldest daughter of a man who owned too much and died too young. That was enough. Guillaume had understood the danger. Before he left on pilgrimage, he had prepared what he could. He had educated Eleanor beyond what most noble women of her era received. Because a daughter who would govern needed to understand what governing required. She spoke Latin. She understood music and poetry in a court where those things were taken seriously as forms of thinking, not merely entertainment. She had grown up watching her father manage the complex relationships of one of the most culturally sophisticated courts in Europe. Her grandfather, Guillaume IX, had been the first troubadour whose work survives. He wrote poetry about desire and loss and the human need to be seen with a directness that shocked and delighted the people around him. Eleanor grew up in a household where language was a form of power and argument was a form of respect. None of that prepared her for what happened next. The French delegation arrived at Bordeaux in June of 1137, led by Suger, the abbot of Saint-Denis, and the most trusted adviser the French crown had. He was not a cruel man. He was a careful one. He understood that what he was collecting from Bordeaux was not simply a bride, but an asset of enormous strategic value, and he intended to deliver that asset safely to Paris. Eleanor rode north with the delegation as Duchess of Aquitaine. That title was hers, not her future husband's. Aquitaine did not transfer to the French crown through this marriage. It remained legally Eleanor's, held by her, governed in her name. This distinction would matter enormously. It would take years for anyone to fully understand how much. The delegation stopped at a small lordship in the Landes region for rest. While they were there, Louis VI died in Paris. The young man Eleanor was riding north to marry became Louis VII overnight. She was now about to become Queen of France. The wedding took place at the Cathedral of Saint-André in Bordeaux in late July of 1137. The ceremony was performed with all the ritual weight the church could bring to bear. The guests feasted for days. No record survives of what Eleanor said or thought during any of it. What survives is what happened immediately after. At least one attempt to intercept Eleanor was made before the wedding party left Bordeaux. The precise details are disputed, but the underlying reality is not she was already, before she had taken a single step toward Paris. Someone powerful men were willing to use force to possess, not because they knew her, because of what she carried. She rode toward Paris as Queen of France, Duchess of Aquitaine, and the solution to a political problem she had not created. She was 15 years old. She had just begun to understand what the world intended to do with her. Eleanor arrived in Paris and found a city that did not know what to do with her. The French royal court operated according to rhythms that had nothing to do with the world she had grown up in. The Capetian monarchy was old and serious and deeply pious in ways that shaped every aspect of how power was exercised and displayed. Louis VII was 22 years old when he married Eleanor. By every account that survives, he was a man who would have been far more comfortable as a monk than as a king. He was not stupid. He was not weak in the simple way that people sometimes describe him. He was a man of genuine religious conviction who took his obligations to God and to his kingdom as real moral responsibilities rather than ceremonial ones. He was also, almost certainly, The wrong husband for Eleanor. This was not primarily a matter of personality. It was a matter of worlds. Aquitaine had spent a century developing a culture of extraordinary sophistication. The troubadour tradition that Eleanor's grandfather helped create was not simply entertainment. It was a set of values, a way of thinking about loyalty and obligation, and the relationship between people that was genuinely different from the values of northern France. In Aquitaine, debate was a pleasure. Complexity was admired. A woman who expressed opinions was interesting rather than threatening. In Paris, Eleanor was interesting in the wrong way. There is a moment from the early years of her marriage that captures what her life in Paris actually felt like. Not from the outside, but from inside the room where decisions were made. It was a council meeting, the kind that happened regularly in any functioning medieval court. Senior advisors gathered around the king to discuss matters of governance. Eleanor was present. She had the right to be present. She had been in rooms like this her entire life. Watching her father manage the complex relationships of a great duchy, a dispute had come before the council involving territories that touched directly on Aquitaine, on roads and revenues that Eleanor understood better than anyone else sitting in that room. She understood the history of the dispute, who held what claim and why, what the likely consequences of each possible resolution would be for the lords involved. She spoke. The room did not stop. It did not erupt. It simply continued in a way that made clear her words had not quite landed, had passed through the conversation, like something the meeting did not have a category for. Louis listened with the careful politeness of a man who loved his wife and was also not entirely sure what to do with her opinion on territorial governance. His advisers listened with the studied neutrality of men who had decided the most dignified response was to treat her contribution as something they had not quite heard. She sat with that. She understood it immediately, with the precision of someone who had just discovered the exact dimensions of the cage she was in. It was not anger she felt in that moment. It was something colder and more useful. It was information. The system she was now living inside did not have a channel for her. She could be present. She could observe. She could know the right answer to every question in the room. What she could not do was make the right answer matter. She filed that knowledge away. She would spend the next 15 years adding to it. The court of Louis VII watched her with the careful attention that powerful institutions give to things they do not fully understand. She was brilliant, and they knew it. She was Duchess of Aquitaine, and they needed it. But she had a quality that the Capetian court found genuinely unsettling, which was the quality of not behaving like someone who understood that her role was primarily decorative. Bernard of Clairvaux, the most powerful churchman in Europe at that time, had strong views about the proper ordering of things. Eleanor was, from his perspective, a woman who did not stay in her proper place. He shaped the moral atmosphere of the court, and the moral atmosphere of the court shaped how Eleanor's behavior was interpreted. A woman from the south, surrounded by southern poets and southern customs, who had opinions about policy and expressed them, looked different in Bernard's moral atmosphere than she might have looked anywhere else. She looked like a problem. For the first few years, the marriage functioned well enough in the way that two people who respect each other's intelligence can function even when they inhabit different moral universes. They traveled together, appeared together at court and ceremony, conducted the visible business of a royal marriage. Then, Eleanor began losing children. Her first pregnancy ended in a daughter, Marie, born in 1145. In the dynastic logic of the Capetian court, a daughter was not what anyone had been hoping for. The court needed a son. Eleanor needed a son to secure her position in a marriage whose political usefulness depended heavily on the production of a male heir. She did not produce one. This is not a minor detail. It sits at the center of everything that follows in her French marriage. Eleanor's failure to produce a male heir gave her critics a language to use against her. It gave Louis's advisors permission to question the value of a marriage that was already, in their view, generating too much friction and not enough stability. The woman from Aquitaine, with her southern poets and her council opinions, had not delivered what a queen was primarily required to deliver, in the moral atmosphere Bernard had helped create. This was not simply a biological fact. It was a verdict. Eleanor spent 15 years in Paris, learning the precise dimensions of a world built to exclude her. She learned which rooms she was allowed to enter and which decisions she was allowed to influence, and exactly how far her voice carried before it stopped mattering. She learned the difference between being present in power and being used by it. She was 30 years old when the marriage finally collapsed. She had been Queen of France since she was 15, and she had spent 15 years accumulating something that was going to prove more valuable than anything the French court had tried to give her. She had learned exactly how power worked when it was arranged to keep you out. That knowledge was not small. She was about to use it. In the spring of 1147, Eleanor of Aquitaine did something that no Queen of France had done before. She went to war, not in the way that later centuries would romanticize it. She did not ride into battle with a sword. She went to war the way powerful medieval rulers went to war, which is to say, she organized her resources, gathered her people, committed her vassals, and moved toward a theater of conflict with the full weight of her position behind her. Louis VII had taken the cross. Pope Eugenius III had called for a new crusade to rescue the Crusader states in the Holy Land. And Louis, with the passionate religious conviction that defined everything he did, had answered immediately. Bernard of Clairvaux preached the crusade at Vézelay in the spring of 1146, and the response was overwhelming. Knights from across France sewed crosses onto their tunics and prepared to march east. Eleanor did not stay home. This requires precision, because what Eleanor did on the Second Crusade has been distorted in both directions by centuries of storytelling. She did not command the French army. She did not ride into battle, but she also did not simply accompany her husband as a decorative presence. She came as Duchess of Aquitaine, and that distinction mattered in ways that were immediately visible to everyone who understood how feudal obligation worked. The vassals of Aquitaine owed loyalty to Eleanor personally, not to Louis. When Eleanor took the cross and called on her Aquitanian lords to follow, they followed her. A significant portion of the crusading force that marched out of France in the summer of 1147 was there because Eleanor had summoned it, funded it, and led it in the feudal sense that leadership actually meant in the 12th century. She had her own household, her own staff, her own revenues drawn from Aquitanian lands, her own relationships with the lords riding alongside her. In the column moving east through the Holy Roman Empire and into Byzantine territory, there was a section that answered to the Queen of France and another section that answered to the Duchess of Aquitaine. In many cases, those were the same people answering to the same woman in two different capacities. This made her visible, in a way that a queen who simply travelled with her husband was not visible. And visibility, as Eleanor was about to discover, is a knife that cuts in every direction. The crusade went badly almost from the beginning. The passage through Byzantine territory was difficult. Relations between the Crusaders and Emperor Manuel were tense from the start. complicated by mutual suspicion and competing interests that no amount of diplomatic courtesy could fully smooth over. The march through Anatolia was brutal. The terrain was harder than expected. The Turkish forces harassing the column were faster and more effective than the Crusaders had anticipated. Supply lines stretched and broke. Men and horses died, not in battle, but from exhaustion and thirst, and the particular misery of a long campaign going wrong in ways no one fully anticipated. Louis made decisions. Some of those decisions were bad. At a mountain crossing near Laodicea in January of 1148, Louis ordered the army to make a night march without properly communicating the plan to all sections of the column. The vanguard moved ahead. The rear guard, which included many of Eleanor's Aquitanian vassals, under the command of a lord named Geoffrey de Rancon, did not receive the order clearly. The column separated in the darkness on the mountain. Turkish forces attacked the isolated sections. The losses were serious. Knights and soldiers died on that mountain in numbers that shook the army's confidence and darkened its mood for weeks. It was a tactical failure born of poor communication. A commander moving faster than his orders could travel. A night march in difficult terrain with an army that was already strained. It was Louis's decision. It was Louis's failure. Someone was responsible for what happened at Laodicea. The question of who would be answered very differently depending on who was doing the answering. And, depending on when the answering happened, think about what it meant to be Eleanor in the days that followed that disaster. She had been visible throughout the march. She had her own contingent. She had expressed opinions about strategy. She was a woman operating in a space that men were supposed to occupy exclusively. When things went wrong, the presence of a visible woman near the catastrophe was itself an explanation. Not because anyone could demonstrate that Eleanor had caused the disaster at Laodicea, but because her visibility made her available as a cause in a way that a queen, who had stayed quietly in the background, would not have been. John of Salisbury, the scholar and churchman who was close to events in this period, wrote about the Crusade without blaming Eleanor for its military failures. His account is careful and focused on the actual decisions and actual commanders involved in the actual disasters. He is, in this regard, a more reliable guide to what happened than many of the writers who came after him. The writers who came after him were not primarily interested in what happened. They were interested in the story. A young knight from Poitiers rode with the Aquitanian contingent through Anatolia and kept a brief record of the march. More inventory than diary. He noted distances and provisions and the condition of horses. He recorded the disaster at Laodicea without speculation about its causes. He recorded the mood of the army in the weeks that followed, the way a large group of people who have been through something traumatic look for a shape to put around what happened, a reason that makes the suffering feel purposeful rather than simply wasteful. Armies in that situation need someone to blame. Eleanor was available. She was prominent. She was southern and therefore slightly foreign even within the French army. She had opinions and expressed them. She had vassals who answered to her rather than to Louis. By the time the Crusaders approached Antioch, the story was already forming. She could feel it forming. She had been in enough rooms, heard enough conversations shift when she entered, watched enough carefully neutral expressions settle onto faces that had been open a moment before, to understand what was happening. The Second Crusade was failing, and the most visible woman in the column was being assembled. Piece by piece, as its explanation, she rode toward Antioch, understanding something she could not have fully understood before she left France. Visibility had a cost. The cost was real, and the way the cost was calculated was never entirely fair, and never entirely random. and never entirely separable from the fact of being a woman in a world that had very specific ideas about what women were and were not permitted to be. The gates of Antioch opened before her. What happened inside those walls would follow her for the rest of her life. There is a version of Eleanor of Aquitaine that was constructed largely without her participation. It began in Antioch in 1148, with a disagreement about military strategy and a marriage that was already coming apart at its foundations. It continued through the decades that followed, shaped by writers who had not been there, informed by sources whose names we do not know, refined by each retelling until it achieved a kind of narrative smoothness that real events rarely have. By the 13th century, Eleanor of Aquitaine was not simply a woman who had supported her uncle's military judgment over her husband's. She was a woman who had betrayed her husband, her vows, her position, and her faith, all in the space of a few weeks in a city on the Syrian coast. The story was compelling. It was coherent. It explained everything that came after in terms that required no further investigation. It was also built almost entirely on inference, rumor, and the particular way that medieval chroniclers treated women who were too powerful and too visible to be comfortably ignored. Sit with the actual evidence for a moment. Raymond of Antioch was Eleanor's uncle, her father's younger brother, a man she had known since childhood, who had come east years earlier and carved out his own Crusader principality on the Syrian coast. When the French Crusaders arrived in Antioch in March of 1148, Raymond had a strategic proposal. He wanted Louis to help him retake Edessa, the Crusader county whose fall had triggered the entire crusade. Taking Edessa back was, Raymond argued, the actual military objective. Jerusalem was safe, for now. Edessa was the wound that needed addressing. Louis refused. He wanted to go directly to Jerusalem. He had made a vow, and he intended to fulfill it. Eleanor supported Raymond's position. This was a military and strategic disagreement. Eleanor, who had spent months watching the army struggle through terrain that was killing it, who had seen the disaster at Laodicea, who understood the logistical realities of the campaign in a way that Louis's religious conviction sometimes prevented him from seeing clearly, thought Raymond's plan made sense. Louis thought his wife was taking her uncle's side against her husband. What happened next is where the sources begin to diverge in ways that tell you as much about the writers as about the events. John of Salisbury was writing within years of what happened in Antioch. He was drawing on sources close to the people involved. He described a serious political and marital confrontation. Eleanor invoked the possibility of annulment on the grounds of consanguinity. The family relationship between her and Louis that church law prohibited. Louis had her removed from the palace by force in the night. The Crusaders left Antioch before dawn. That is what John recorded. A political dispute, a marital crisis, a departure under tense circumstances. He did not describe an affair. He did not suggest that Eleanor's support for Raymond had any basis other than her genuine assessment of the military situation. Now look at what Richard of Devizes wrote, roughly 50 years later. Richard had not been to Antioch. He had not spoken to anyone who had been to Antioch within living memory. But he wrote about Eleanor with a confidence and a specificity that John's account entirely lacks. His Eleanor was a more dramatic figure, a more scandalous one, a better subject for the kind of writing that audiences in his era enjoyed. And then the accounts written a century after Richard were more dramatic still. This is how it works. The story does not appear fully formed. It accumulates. Each generation of writers adds a layer of specificity. A detail that was not in the previous account, but that makes the previous account feel more plausible in retrospect. The narrative becomes more internally consistent as it moves further from what actually happened. The story became more coherent as it became less true. Imagine a secretary working in Raymond's court during those weeks. A man who sat in the meetings between Raymond and Louis and their respective advisors, whose job was to record what was actually decided, who heard the actual arguments about troop movements and supply lines and the relative strategic value of Edessa versus Jerusalem. His notes, if they had survived, would show what was genuinely being discussed in those rooms. Military strategy, the future of the Crusader states, the question of where an exhausted army could most effectively direct its remaining strength. Eleanor was in some of those meetings. She had been in political meetings her entire adult life. She had opinions, and she expressed them. That is what happened in Antioch. Everything else is the story that the 12th century needed to tell about a woman who was too visible, in the wrong place, at the wrong time. But here is the mechanism that matters most. Bernard of Clairvaux had already spent years framing Eleanor as a destabilizing presence in the French court, not because she had done anything specific he could point to, but because her manner of being in the world conflicted with his understanding of how women should occupy their roles. She was too much, too southern, too confident, too present in spaces where women were supposed to be background. Bernard's framing did not create the scandal at Antioch, but it created the interpretive context in which the events at Antioch were read. When writers reached for an explanation of what happened between Eleanor and Louis in Raymond's court, they reached into a cultural atmosphere that Bernard had helped build, an atmosphere in which a woman like Eleanor was already understood as capable of exactly the kind of behavior she was being accused of. She did not get to participate in that interpretation. She could not write her own account. She could not dispatch her own historians. She could not sit across from her accusers and require them to produce their evidence. The mechanisms that might have allowed her to challenge the story being built around her did not exist for women in the 12th century. What she could do was live her life in ways that contradicted the narrative. She could not erase it. Louis had Eleanor taken from the palace by force that night. The Crusaders left Antioch before dawn. Eleanor rode east toward Jerusalem in the pre-dawn dark, with Louis's decision made for her, as decisions had been made for her since she was 15 years old. She had been a queen for 10 years. She had traveled to the edge of the known world. She had watched a crusade fail in slow motion, while the men around her argued about whose fault it was. She understood now, with complete clarity, what the price of visibility was. She also understood something else. The story being told about her was not going to stop. It was going to grow. Future writers were going to add details that current writers had not yet imagined. The account that started as a political disagreement between a queen and her husband was going to become, with time and retelling, something that required no evidence, because it had become something everyone already knew. She could not fight the story. She could only make sure the story was not the whole truth. She rode toward Jerusalem. She was already thinking about what came next. The marriage ended the way it had lived, in paperwork and politics, dressed up in the language of the church, on March 21st, 1152. At the Council of Beaugency on the Loire River, a panel of French bishops declared the marriage of Louis VII and Eleanor of Aquitaine null and void. The official reason was consanguinity. They were related within the prohibited degrees of kinship. This had been true since the day they married 15 years earlier. Nobody had mentioned it then because nobody had wanted to mention it then. Now both parties wanted out. And consanguinity was the door the church provided. Eleanor walked out of Beaugency as Duchess of Aquitaine, not as a divorced woman in the modern sense, not as someone who had failed at marriage and was retreating in shame. She walked out as the ruler of the largest territory in France, legally restored to full authority over her lands, answerable to no husband, subject to no man's direct control for the first time since she was 15 years old. She was 30 years old. She had been waiting 15 years for this. The standard account of the annulment focuses on what Louis lost. He lost the political connection to Aquitaine that Eleanor's body and her obedience had provided for 15 years. He lost it because he had no son. And without a son, the marriage had no future. The Capetian court could use. What the standard account underweights is what Eleanor had planned. The annulment did not surprise her. She had been working toward it. The invocation of consanguinity at Antioch had not been an emotional outburst. It had been a legal argument, filed early in case she needed it later. She had needed it. She used it. But Eleanor understood something that Louis either did not understand or chose not to think about until it was too late. The moment the annulment was granted, she became the most dangerous person in France. Not dangerous because she was angry, dangerous because she was free, female, and enormously wealthy in a world that had no procedure for dealing with that combination except marriage. A duchess without a husband was a vacancy in the feudal system. The system did not have a category for a powerful woman who was simply herself, controlling vast resources with no male intermediary. The system would fill that vacancy. The only question was who would fill it first. Eleanor knew this. She had spent 15 years learning how the system worked from the inside. She had 2 months. The road from Beaugency back to Poitiers ran through territory controlled by lords who understood the situation as clearly as she did. 2 of them moved to intercept her before she reached safety. Theobald of Blois tried to capture her near Blois. A member of the Angevin family attempted the same thing further south. Eleanor avoided both of them. The chronicles describe her movements in those weeks as quick and deliberate. A woman who had planned her route with the understanding that every bridge and every ford was a potential ambush point. She reached Poitiers. She was safe. For now, safe in the limited sense that she was on her own land, surrounded by her own people, in the city where she had grown up. But safety in the 12th century was not a condition you could simply maintain by being in the right place. It required constant reinforcement, which meant it required a husband. She sent word to Henry of Anjou. Henry was 19 years old. He was Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou, and the most energetically ambitious young man in the Western world. He was also, through his mother Empress Matilda, the legitimate claimant to the throne of England, a throne currently occupied by King Stephen, whose grip on it was weakening by the year. Henry had everything except the resources to press his claims at the scale they required. Eleanor had Aquitaine. They met, by some accounts, at the French court the previous year. When Henry came to pay homage to Louis, whether they had spoken privately then, whether there was something between them already, the sources do not settle clearly. What is clear is that the marriage negotiations moved with a speed that suggested both parties had been thinking about this before the moment formally arrived. On the 18th of May, 1152, 8 weeks after the annulment at Beaugency, Eleanor of Aquitaine married Henry of Anjou at the Cathedral of Saint-Pierre in Poitiers. 8 weeks. People have spent centuries interpreting those 8 weeks as evidence of passion, of a romance that had been building since that first glimpse at the French court, of Eleanor's heart finally going where her circumstances had previously prevented it. Maybe some of that is true. Romantic feeling and political calculation are not mutually exclusive, and there is no reason to assume Eleanor was incapable of both simultaneously. But the 8 weeks also tell a simpler and more important story. Eleanor understood that the window was closing. Every week she remained unmarried was a week in which some other man, with enough soldiers and enough ambition, might find a way to force the issue. The system demanded a husband. She was going to choose her own. Henry was the right choice for reasons that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with the future she was building. He was young, which meant decades of active rule ahead, rather than the complications of managing an aging husband's decline. He was capable in the way that mattered most in the 12th century. Effective with armies, and effective with administration, and effective at the brutal work of making people do what he needed them to do. He had ambitions that matched the scale of what Eleanor was bringing to the marriage, which meant he would not be threatened by her resources, but would find ways to use them, and he was not French. This last point deserves more attention than it usually receives. Louis VII was the King of France. Eleanor's autonomy within her French marriage had always been constrained by the fact that her husband was simultaneously her overlord in the feudal hierarchy. Henry of Anjou was not her overlord. He held his titles from a different branch of the feudal tree entirely. The marriage to Henry did not erase Eleanor's independence. It created a different kind of structure, one in which she brought Aquitaine as a genuine partner rather than a subsidiary. A notary working in the ducal administration at Poitiers drafted the documents related to Eleanor's change of status in the weeks following the marriage. Any careful clerk processing those papers would have noticed something worth noting. The documents relating to Aquitaine specifically were drawn up in a way that kept the duchy legally distinct from Henry's other territories. Aquitaine was Eleanor's. The marriage created an alliance between Aquitaine and the Angevin holdings. It did not merge them. Someone had made sure of that. The notary would have had a reasonable idea who. He sealed the documents and put them in the archive. 2 years later, Henry became King of England. Eleanor became Queen of England. The territories they controlled together stretched from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees, a map that no single power had commanded since the Carolingians. The largest empire in the Western world had been assembled partly through conquest, partly through inheritance, and partly through the 8 weeks Eleanor of Aquitaine spent between Beaugency and Poitiers, making the most consequential decision of her life. Louis VII watched it happen from Paris. He had lost Aquitaine. He had lost the woman who came with it. He had lost the strategic position that 15 years of marriage had provided. He had lost all of it in 8 weeks, because the system that was supposed to give him control over Eleanor had. In the end, given her just enough room to move, he eventually remarried. He eventually had a son. He spent the rest of his reign watching Eleanor and Henry build the empire that his own failure to hold her had helped create. Eleanor did not look back. She had taken Aquitaine back. She had known from the beginning that she would. Henry Plantagenet, in 1152, was not a man you could easily categorize. He was 19 years old, and he moved through the world with the focused restlessness of someone who had too much energy for any single room to contain. People who encountered him in this period describe a man of medium height, broad through the shoulders, with reddish hair, and the kind of physical presence that made you aware of him before he spoke. He did not sit still. He thought while pacing. He conducted business while eating, while walking, while doing 3 other things at once. His court officials learned to keep up or fall behind, and the ones who fell behind did not remain court officials for long. He was also, by any honest assessment. One of the most gifted rulers of the 12th century. Not gifted in the way that looks like gifts from a distance. Not charming or lucky or beloved in the easy sense. Gifted in the harder sense. Genuinely capable of the sustained, grinding, intellectually demanding work of organizing large amounts of power over large amounts of territory, containing large amounts of people who did not automatically agree with each other. He understood law. He understood administration. He understood how to build institutions that outlasted the immediate crisis that prompted their creation. Eleanor understood all of the same things. This is the part of the story that tends to get lost in the romantic versions, which prefer a narrative of passion to a narrative of partnership. The romantic version of Eleanor and Henry is about desire and its eventual destruction. A woman who fell for the wrong man, or a man who could not stay faithful to the right woman, or some version of both. That version is not false, but it misses what actually brought them together. Eleanor was 30. She had spent 15 years as Queen of France, managing the gap between her actual capabilities and what the French court was willing to assign her. She had run Aquitaine, organized crusaders, navigated the most sophisticated diplomatic court in Europe, and survived a failed military campaign with her political instincts intact. She was not looking for someone to protect her. She was looking for someone to build with. When Eleanor looked at Henry, she was not primarily seeing a young man with reddish hair and restless energy. She was reading him the way she had learned to read everyone in her world, for the structure of his power, for where it was strong and where it was not, for what he was actually capable of and what he only appeared capable of. What she saw was this: Henry needed Aquitaine, not as decoration, not as a symbolic addition to his territorial claims, but as the southern anchor of an empire he was trying to assemble. Without Aquitaine, his holdings in France were geographically disconnected and strategically exposed. With Aquitaine, the map changed entirely. He also needed someone who understood governance at the level Eleanor understood it. He was 19 and brilliant and moving fast, and the empire he was trying to build was going to require more than his personal presence to hold together. He needed a partner who could hold the center while he was at the edges. Eleanor saw all of this. She also saw something that was harder to name and ultimately more important. Henry looked at her power and did not flinch from it. He did not need to manage it or contain it or explain to her why it would be better expressed through a more appropriate channel. He looked at what she had and what she could do, and he thought about how to use it, which in Eleanor's experience was something genuinely new. Louis had looked at Eleanor and seen a problem. Henry looked at Eleanor and saw a resource. The difference between those two views was not simply a matter of affection. It was a structural difference in how the marriage would function. This mattered to Eleanor more than romance. They married in May of 1152, and 2 years later Henry was King of England. In the early years, the partnership worked. Henry was frequently in motion, crossing the Channel, moving between England and the continental territories, managing the crises that accumulated at the edges of a territory too large for any single ruler to hold through presence alone. When he was in England, Eleanor governed portions of the continental lands. When he was in Normandy, Eleanor governed England. The pipe rolls, the financial records of the English crown, show her receiving revenues, issuing orders, making decisions as Queen of England in ways that were more than ceremonial. She was not a regent in the formal sense. Not yet. She was a queen who was genuinely capable of the work of governing, who had a husband who recognized that capability and made use of it, a royal clerk who worked in the chancery during this period and later wrote brief notes about his years in service, remembered the court of Henry and Eleanor as a place of extraordinary intensity. Everything moved fast. Decisions happened quickly. The atmosphere had the quality of a large enterprise operating near the edge of its capacity, always generating new business, new problems, new arrangements to be made. What he remembered most clearly about Eleanor was a quality he struggled to put into words. He wrote that she seemed to understand everything happening around her, not just the surface of events, but the architecture beneath them. She knew why things were happening in the order they were happening. She knew what would follow from each decision made in the present. He had worked for Henry too. He noted that Henry had the same quality. He wrote that he had never worked for two people simultaneously who both possessed it. He did not write what it was like when those two people eventually pointed that quality at each other rather than at the problems they were supposed to be solving together. He did not need to. Anyone who knew what came later could fill in that gap themselves. The partnership was real. It was also, from the beginning, built on an asymmetry that the work of the early years made easy to overlook. Eleanor brought Aquitaine. Henry brought England and Normandy and Anjou. On paper, a marriage between two great powers of roughly comparable territorial strength. In practice, Henry was King of England, which meant the formal structure of authority in the most powerful part of the empire ran through him, not through her. Eleanor's power was real. It was also consistently one step removed from the official channels through which power was recorded and recognized. She signed documents. Henry signed more documents. She made decisions. Henry made more decisions. She was present at court. Henry presided over court. In the early years, when the shared project of building the empire consumed enough energy to crowd out everything else, this asymmetry was manageable. The work was large enough to absorb the difference. But asymmetries do not disappear because you stop looking at them. They accumulate, they wait. Eleanor knew this. She had grown up in the gap between formal power and real power. She understood the difference between them better than almost anyone alive. She kept working. They both kept working. And underneath the work, quietly and without announcement, something was putting itself in place that would eventually demand to be addressed. There is a map that any historian of the Plantagenet period will show you when they want to explain what Henry II built. It covers an enormous stretch of Western Europe. England, Normandy, Anjou, Maine, Touraine, and then covering the entire southwestern quarter of France from the Loire to the Pyrenees, a territory larger than all the others combined. That territory is Aquitaine. It did not belong to Henry. It was not conquered by Henry. It was not inherited by Henry through his father or his mother or any claim his family had ever pressed. It came into the Plantagenet Empire through one person and one person only, and her name appears in the documents of the period as Queen of England, which is accurate, and as Duchess of Aquitaine, which is more important. Remove Eleanor from that map, and you do not have a smaller version of the same empire. You have a different empire entirely, one that stops at the Loire, one without the wine country of Bordeaux, without the trade routes of the Garonne Valley, without the political relationships with the lords of Gascony and Poitou, who owed loyalty to Eleanor personally, and through her to the Plantagenet crown. This should be obvious. It is stated clearly in every serious historical account of the period, and yet when people talk about the empire of Henry II, they talk about Henry II. Walk through what Eleanor was actually doing in the years between 1154, when Henry became King of England, and the late 1160s. When things between them began to change, Henry was in motion constantly. He crossed the Channel more than 24 times during his reign, moving between England and the continental territories with the restless urgency of a man who understood that governing by presence was the only kind of governing that fully worked in the 12th century. He could not be in two places simultaneously. Nobody could. When Henry was in England, Eleanor managed significant portions of the continental territories. When Henry was in Normandy, Eleanor governed England. The pipe rolls from this period. The financial records of the English crown that survive in considerable detail show her receiving revenues, issuing writs, authorizing payments, sitting in judgment on disputes, corresponding with papal legates and foreign courts. She was also, in the same years, having children, 8 children with Henry in roughly 12 years, 5 sons and 3 daughters. The children arrived at regular intervals through the 1150s and into the 1160s, and the records show Eleanor managing pregnancy and governance simultaneously, appearing in administrative documents and at court events. In the same years she was producing the heirs. The dynasty required. The records do not pause to acknowledge this. They simply continue listing her activities. The children appear and are absorbed into the management of royal households. Eleanor continues. This is worth sitting with for a moment. Imagine a Tuesday morning in Westminster, sometime in the 1160s. Henry is in Normandy. Eleanor is in England. There is a dispute before her between 2 lords over the boundaries of their respective estates. A dispute with roots going back 2 generations and legal complications that require someone with genuine knowledge of both English and Aquitanian land law to untangle. There are letters waiting from the papal legate in Rome about ecclesiastical appointments that Henry needs to respond to and cannot respond to from across the Channel quickly enough. There are household accounts to review, military obligations to assess, the constant stream of petitions and complaints and administrative decisions that constitutes the daily reality of governing one of the largest territories in Europe. Eleanor handles all of it. She does not do it as a substitute for the real king. She does it as the person who is actually there, actually capable, and actually responsible for the center holding while the edges are being managed. A bishop who attended one of the great councils of this period wrote afterward to a colleague about the experience of seeing the royal family assembled. He was not writing political analysis. He was writing a letter, describing what he had observed with the careful eye of a man who spent his professional life reading rooms and the people in them. He wrote about Henry with admiration and a trace of something that was not quite fear but adjacent to it. The combination that Henry seems to have inspired in most people who encountered him professionally. He wrote about Eleanor differently. He wrote that she had the quality of a person who was simultaneously fully present in the room and slightly apart from it. Not cold, not distant, more like someone watching the same event on 2 levels at once, participating in what was visible on the surface while reading something underneath that the other participants could not see. He did not know what to make of it. He wrote that it made him uneasy in a way he could not entirely account for. He filed the letter and returned to his diocese. What he had observed, without the framework to name it, was what 15 years as Queen of France and a decade as Queen of England had produced in Eleanor. She had spent her adult life operating inside systems that were simultaneously dependent on her and designed to limit her. She had learned to read those systems at a depth that people who simply functioned within them could not reach, because they did not need to. Eleanor needed to. Her survival had always depended on it. Now here is the thing about that map. The administrative records of Henry's reign describe the work of the crown. They record decisions made, and revenues collected, and disputes resolved. They very rarely specify who was in the room when a decision was made, or whose thinking shaped the resolution of a dispute. They are the records of the monarchy as an institution, not of the two specific people who were running it. Eleanor's name appears when she acted formally, when she signed a document or issued a writ or appeared at a ceremony. Her name does not appear in the countless conversations and assessments and strategic calculations that happened in the hours before any formal action was taken. She signed documents. He signed more documents. The empire bore his name. She had known this from the beginning. She had chosen it anyway, because the alternative was a French court that offered even less and a system that offered nothing at all. But knowing something in advance does not make it easier to live with when it arrives in full. There is a moment in the mid-1160s, not a single documented event, but the accumulated weight of many ordinary days, when Eleanor began to feel the shape of what the coming years were going to look like. Henry was building something extraordinary. The legal reforms of his reign were genuine achievements that would shape English institutions for centuries. The expansion of royal courts, the development of common law, the use of travelling justices to bring royal authority to the provinces. These were real contributions to the world. He and Eleanor were governing together. Eleanor was part of building all of it. Her name was not on any of it. One afternoon in England, somewhere in the later part of that decade, Eleanor stood in a room that was briefly empty and looked at the documents stacked on the table before her. Writs, accounts, petitions, the daily paper of an empire. Her handwriting was on several of them. Her seal was pressed into the wax of others. Her decisions had shaped the contents of a dozen more. The empire was real. The work was real. The partnership was real, and she could see, standing in that room, with the documents in front of her, exactly how much of it was visible and exactly how much of it was not. She picked up the next document. She got back to work. It was what she always did. But she was also, by this point, beginning to think about what would happen if the partnership changed. If Henry decided that the structure they had built together no longer needed her at the center of it, if the asymmetry that had always been present in the background of the marriage moved, as asymmetries eventually do, to the foreground, she was thinking about what she would do then. She was already, in ways she had not yet fully articulated, even to herself, beginning to plan. Around 1168, Henry sent Eleanor back to Poitiers. The language of the chronicles is vague about this, as it tends to be vague about anything involving Eleanor that Henry might have preferred not to have clearly documented. The official reason, to the extent there was one, seems to have been administrative. Aquitaine needed governing from closer range. Eleanor was the Duchess. It made sense for her to be there. What also made sense, from Henry's perspective, is harder to document but not difficult to read from what happened around it. The partnership had been changing for years. Henry had taken a mistress, a young woman named Rosamond Clifford, and he had done so with a visibility that was different from his earlier infidelities. He had always had affairs. Eleanor had managed that knowledge the way queens managed such knowledge, setting it aside and continuing to work. But Rosamond was handled differently. Henry was not keeping her in the background. Whether this was carelessness or a message, the effect was the same. Eleanor was being displaced, not from Henry's bed, which by this point she may have had limited interest in defending, from the position of primary political partner that the marriage had been built on, There was also the matter of the children. Henry's management of the inheritance was creating tensions that Eleanor had been watching with growing unease. He had crowned his eldest son, Henry, as junior king of England in 1170. A move designed to secure the succession, but one that gave young Henry a title without the authority to exercise it. Richard was associated with Aquitaine, but not given genuine control of it. Geoffrey was connected to Brittany through a betrothal to the Breton heiress, Constance. The children were positioned and costumed for roles they were not yet allowed to play. Eleanor saw where this was going. But Poitiers in 1168 was not exile in the sense that it would become exile 2 years later. Eleanor arrived in the city of her childhood as its governing duchess, with resources and freedom of movement, and something she had not had in years: space. She used it. What Eleanor built at Poitiers in the years between 1168 and 1173 is one of the most remarkable and consistently undervalued chapters of her life. Later centuries would decide that the court at Poitiers was primarily about romance, about poetry and courtly love, and the games that idle aristocrats played when they had nothing better to do. That reading misses almost everything important about what actually happened there. Eleanor built a center of cultural power at a moment when she had been pushed out of political power. The troubadour tradition that her grandfather had helped create was not decoration. It was a system of values. It asked questions about loyalty and obligation, and the relationship between inner life and outward action that the dominant institutions of the 12th century, the church and the feudal court, generally preferred not to ask. It created space in which those questions could be explored, argued about, and shaped into forms that traveled. Poetry and music in that world were not entertainment in the modern sense. They were how ideas moved. Eleanor understood this better than almost anyone. She gathered poets and musicians. She commissioned work, evaluated it, rewarded excellence, and shaped the direction of a cultural conversation that was happening across the southern French-speaking world. Her daughter Marie of Champagne was there, herself a significant patron of literature. The Arthurian romances that would shape European storytelling for centuries were being written in the orbit of courts like Eleanor's, by poets who understood that what they were writing was not escapism, but a serious examination of how people should live. A young troubadour from the Limousin arrived at Poitiers sometime around 1170. He was in his early 20s, trained in the tradition but not yet established enough to have reliable patronage. He had performed at other courts. He knew what that experience was like. The polite attention and modest rewards and generic encouragement that people in positions of power gave to artists they found acceptable but not remarkable. Poitiers was different from the moment he walked in. He performed his verses, and the response was not what he was used to. Questions came back at him. Specific questions about choices he had made. Why had he used that image rather than a different one? What was he actually trying to say about the emotion he had described? And had he said it? Or had he described it from the outside without getting inside it? Someone in the room. And he was not entirely certain who, because the conversation had multiple voices, pushed back on a resolution he had written, as though the resolution was too easy, too clean, not faithful to the actual complexity of the thing he was working with. He had never been asked to defend his work before. He had never been asked to think about his work as something that could be better, rather than simply acceptable or unacceptable. He rewrote 3 of the verses after that first performance. When he left Poitiers some weeks later, he carried those revised verses and a different understanding of what he was doing. He could not fully explain the difference. He knew it was there, years later. Trying to describe the court at Poitiers to a younger colleague who had not been there. He reached for the quality that set it apart from everywhere else he had worked. He said that most courts wanted art that confirmed what the court already believed. That made patrons feel that their values were correct and their world was properly ordered. Poitiers wanted something else. It wanted art that pushed against the edges of what anyone had thought before. Art that asked uncomfortable questions and did not provide easy answers. He said it was the only court he had ever performed at, where the woman at the center of the room was clearly the most capable person in it, and where that fact was treated as entirely ordinary, as the natural state of things, as something that required no explanation or justification. He said he had spent the rest of his life trying to find a court like it. He never did. Eleanor had been pushed out of the center of political power. Henry had done what powerful men do when they want to reduce a powerful woman without the political cost of a direct confrontation. He had moved her to the periphery through the language of administrative necessity. She had taken the periphery and built something in it that political power could not touch. The world Henry controlled ran on laws and armies and the management of land and obligation. The world Eleanor built at Poitiers ran on something that could not be taxed or conscripted or legally restrained. It ran on the ideas people used to understand themselves, on the questions they were willing to ask about how they should live and what they owed each other and what loyalty actually meant when the formal structures of loyalty were in conflict with what they knew to be true. Henry could reach a great many things. He could not reach that. But Eleanor was also watching the wider situation with the clarity that Poitiers gave her. A clarity that came from being slightly removed from the center and therefore able to see the shape of the whole. She could see what Henry was doing with the children's inheritances. She could see the resentment building in young Henry, who had a crown and no power. She could see Richard, who had been told Aquitaine would be his. Watching his mother's duchy being administered by his father's men, she could see Geoffrey, attached to Brittany through an arrangement he had no say in. She could see where it was going, and she had spent enough years in enough rooms where decisions were made to understand that seeing where something is going is not the same as being able to stop it. What she had to decide was whether she was going to try. In the spring of 1173, 3 of Eleanor's sons rode away from their father, Henry, the young king. Richard and Geoffrey raised their banners against Henry II, King of England, Duke of Normandy, Count of Anjou, the most powerful ruler in Western Europe, and their father. They did it with the support of the King of France. They did it with the backing of several major Flemish and Norman lords who had their own grievances against the English crown. They did it with, at minimum, the knowledge and active encouragement of their mother. This is the event that everything before it was building toward and everything after it grew out of. It is also the event most consistently misread in Eleanor's story, flattened into either a tale of maternal betrayal or a tale of justified resistance, when the reality was something more complicated and more interesting than either version allows. Start with the sons. Henry the young king was 18 years old in 1173. He had been crowned junior king of England 3 years earlier, a ceremony that gave him the title of king while giving him none of the actual authority that title implied. He could not issue charters without his father's countersignature. He could not appoint officials. He could not govern. He had the costume of kingship without the substance. He was also, by the accounts of people who knew him, genuinely charming and genuinely frustrated in equal measure. He spent money he did not have on the tournaments and entertainments that were the social currency of his class. He borrowed from his father. He was denied the authority to generate his own revenue. He was 18 years old and already in debt to the man who had given him a crown, with no kingdom attached to it. Richard was 15. Geoffrey was 14. They had been assigned their inheritances in theory. Aquitaine for Richard, Brittany for Geoffrey, and denied the practical authority to manage those inheritances in practice. Henry kept control. Henry always kept control. This was, in the dynastic logic of the 12th century, a combustible situation. Fathers and sons in great houses had fought over inheritance and authority for as long as great houses had existed. The King of France, Louis VII, had an obvious strategic interest in encouraging instability in the Plantagenet territories. He offered young Henry refuge and support. Young Henry accepted. The rebellion was not a surprise to anyone who had been watching the Plantagenet court with clear eyes. The conditions that produced it had been developing for years. Eleanor had clear eyes. What exactly she did to encourage or organize the rebellion is something the sources refuse to settle cleanly. Henry believed she was central to it. He acted on that belief. Whether his belief was entirely accurate, partially accurate, or shaped by the convenient availability of Eleanor as an explanation for a rebellion that had structural causes beyond any single person, is a question the evidence cannot fully resolve. What the evidence does show is this: Eleanor was at Poitiers when the rebellion began. The young men who gathered around her court in the preceding years included many of the same lords who would support the uprising. She had spent years building a political and cultural network in Aquitaine and Poitou that operated independently of Henry's direct control. She was the mother of 3 of the 4 main figures in the uprising. She also had reasons that went beyond maternal sympathy for frustrated sons. Henry had been systematically reducing her role in the governance of the empire for years. The move to Poitiers had not been a promotion. The increasing visibility of Rosamond Clifford was not simply a private insult. Henry's management of the children's inheritances kept Eleanor's influence over Aquitaine, in particular, constrained in ways that conflicted directly with her understanding of her own rights as Duchess. Think about what Eleanor was actually doing when she supported the rebellion. She was doing what any feudal lord did when they believed the distribution of power was unjust. She was backing a claim that her sons had genuine grounds to press. Young Henry had been given a title without substance. Richard had been promised a duchy. He was not allowed to govern. These were legitimate grievances within the framework of feudal obligation, and supporting those grievances through political and material backing was exactly the kind of action that male lords took regularly, without anyone describing it as betrayal. Henry had done the same thing to his own overlord, the King of France, earlier in his career. But Eleanor was not a male lord, and that difference, which had shaped everything in her life from the moment her father died on that road in Spain, was about to shape this too. The rebellion failed. It failed because Henry was better at war than his sons, better at politics than his enemies, and better at the grinding work of outlasting a crisis than anyone else in the field. He moved with characteristic speed, neutralizing threats before they could combine into something unmanageable. The King of France was contained. The Flemish allies were dealt with. The Norman barons who had wavered came back into line when it became clear that Henry was not going to fall. By the autumn of 1174, it was over. Henry made peace with his sons. He negotiated terms with young Henry. With Richard, with Geoffrey, he was generous in the way that powerful men are generous when they have won completely and can afford to be, granting concessions that cost him little and demonstrating the magnanimity expected of a victorious king. The sons returned to their positions within the empire, chastened but not destroyed. Eleanor was different. Henry did not negotiate with Eleanor. He did not offer terms. He did not give her the opportunity to submit and be received back into favor. He captured her, or had her captured, somewhere in the Loire Valley, almost certainly while she was attempting to reach the French court or some other place of safety. Some accounts say she was found disguised as a man. Whether that detail is accurate or a later addition to make the story more dramatic is impossible to verify. What is verifiable is what happened next. She was imprisoned, not formally charged, not tried before any court that produced a public record, not executed, simply removed, taken from whatever road she had been traveling and placed under guard in a series of castles that would change over the years but would share a single defining quality. Eleanor could not leave them. The choice not to execute her was not mercy in the simple sense. Eleanor was Duchess of Aquitaine. Killing her would have created an immediate legal and political crisis involving the succession to her duchy, the loyalty of Aquitanian lords, and the reaction of every other power in Europe with an interest in the stability of the Western French territories. Henry was ruthless, but he was not reckless. He understood the difference between what he wanted to do and what he could afford to do. What he could afford to do was make her disappear. Think about what that meant from inside Eleanor's experience of it. She had been watching the situation develop for years. She had made her calculation and acted on it, supporting a rebellion that had genuine legal and political grounds. She had done what lords did. She had lost, and now she was on a road going somewhere she had not chosen. Under guard, with the particular clarity of someone who has just understood the full extent of what they have walked into. There was a military officer charged with escorting Eleanor from her point of capture to her first place of confinement. He had served Henry for years. He had carried out difficult orders before. He had ridden beside prisoners before. This was different, and he knew it was different, though he could not have explained precisely why, without saying things that were not safe to say. He had seen Eleanor at court many times over the years. He had watched her operate in council, observed her handling disputes, been present at ceremonies where she and Henry appeared together as the twin centers of an empire. She had always had the quality he associated with people who were genuinely at home in power. Not the performance of ease, but the real thing. The settled confidence of someone who had been handling authority long enough that it no longer required effort. She had that quality on the road. She did not weep. She did not argue. She asked 2 practical questions about the conditions of her confinement and received his answers and said nothing further. He rode beside her for 2 days. He thought about those 2 days for a long time afterward. What he could not reconcile was the gap between what he was doing and what the woman he was doing it to had actually done. He was not a man given to political philosophy. He was a soldier, but even he could see that Eleanor had not done anything that a man in her position would have been punished for. She had supported her sons in a claim they had every right to press. She had done what lords did when they thought the distribution of power was unjust. Henry had done the same thing to his own overlord years before. The difference was Eleanor. She had done it while being a woman in a world that had decided women were not supposed to do it. That was the crime. It was the only crime. He delivered her to her keepers and rode back south. He did not look back. Looking back would not have changed anything, and would only have made the ride home longer. There is a stretch in the middle of Eleanor's captivity for which almost no record of her survives. Not a letter, not a mention in a chronicle, not a reference in an administrative document, not a note in a household account. Nothing. She was alive. She was somewhere in England. In one of the castles, Henry used to hold her over the years. Chinon before her transfer. Then, Old Sarum, then Winchester, then others, moving between locations with a regularity that may have been Henry's way of ensuring she could not establish the kind of local connections that might become useful to her. But for stretches of months, and sometimes longer, she was invisible in the record. This is what Henry intended. Understand what imprisonment meant for someone like Eleanor, because it was not primarily about physical confinement. Though the physical confinement was real, she was not free to move. She was not free to travel. She was not free to receive visitors without approval that was rarely granted. The castles were not dungeons. She had servants, reasonable comfort, the material conditions that her status required and that Henry was obligated to provide, because the alternative was a public scandal about the treatment of a queen. The imprisonment was primarily about erasure. In the 12th century, power was visibility. A lord who was absent from his lands lost influence over those lands. A patron who was not accessible lost the relationships that patronage created. A political figure who could not correspond freely, who could not receive visitors, who could not appear at councils or courts or ceremonies, did not simply have diminished power. They were, for practical purposes, absent from the world in which power operated. Henry was not torturing Eleanor. He was doing something that, in the political logic of the 12th century, was almost more effective. He was removing her from the world in which she had meaning. Think about what that meant in practice. The Aquitanian lords who owed loyalty to her personally had to find ways to manage that loyalty in the absence of the person it was owed to. Some transferred their practical allegiance to Henry's administration of the duchy. The network Eleanor had spent decades building at Poitiers, and through her relationships across southern France, did not disappear. But it had no center. It drifted. The cultural world she had created at Poitiers continued without her. But without her presence, it changed. The poets went to other patrons. The quality of attention she had brought to the intellectual life of her duchy was not replaceable by anyone else, because it had been inseparable from her specifically. Eleanor understood what was happening. She was not a woman who comforted herself with illusions about her situation. She knew that every month that passed was a month in which her influence contracted, in which the relationships she had built weakened, in which the world restructured itself around her absence. Henry was almost succeeding. Imagine a morning at Old Sarum, sometime in the middle years of the Captivity, before the walls have fully warmed from the previous day's sun, the kind of cold that settles into English stone and stays there. Eleanor is awake before the guards change. She has been awake for some time. Sleep in these years comes and goes on its own schedule, not on the schedule she would choose. She sits with what she knows. She knows the political situation outside these walls better than most people who are free to move through it, because she has spent her life learning to read it, and because even limited information, arriving in fragments through whatever channels she has been able to maintain, is more than enough for someone who understands the architecture of the problem. She knows that young Henry is still chafing against the constraints his father has placed on him. She knows that Richard is governing Aquitaine with the fierce competence she recognized in him when he was a boy. She knows that John, the youngest, is becoming the favorite that dangerous favorites always become, trusted beyond his capacity, because he is available in a way that more capable people are not. She knows that Henry is aging, that the empire he has built is showing the strains that all empires show, when the person who built them is still holding everything personally, instead of through institutions strong enough to function without them. She knows that the situation is not permanent. She has always known that the question has never been whether it ends. The question is what she will do in the hours between now and the moment it ends. and what she will be capable of when that moment arrives. She picks up the book she has been reading, a guard assigned to one of her places of confinement, a soldier who rotated through his shifts with the patient regularity of a professional, saw Eleanor most days in the way that guards see people they are keeping, at a distance, through the patterns of controlled movement that confinement creates. He noticed things the way soldiers notice things, not analytically, but with the practical attention of someone whose job requires awareness of the environment. He noticed that she read constantly, not the way people read to pass time, moving their eyes across the page without taking anything in. She read with the focused attention of someone working on something, someone for whom the book was a conversation she was engaged in, rather than a distraction from her circumstances. He noticed that she never complained, not about the cold, not about the food, not about the specific indignities that confinement imposed. She managed her circumstances with the quiet efficiency of someone who had decided that energy spent on complaint was energy that could be spent on something more useful. He noticed, most of all, that she did not look beaten. He had seen beaten people. He had guarded prisoners who had been broken by their confinement, people who had internalized their captivity in ways that showed in how they held themselves, how they moved through the small space, allowed them, how they looked at the walls around them as though the walls had become the whole world. Eleanor did not look like that. She looked like a person who was somewhere temporarily. He did not know where she thought she was going. He was a guard. It was not his business. He did his shifts and went back to the barracks. He thought about it more than was necessary. In the outer world, Henry continued to govern. He dealt with his sons, who continued to cause him trouble. Young Henry died in 1183 of dysentery, while in rebellion against his father again. Geoffrey died in 1186, crushed in a tournament accident in Paris. Richard, who had been fighting his father intermittently for years, aligned himself openly with the King of France in 1188. Henry's empire was fracturing around him, while Eleanor sat in her castle and read and waited. She did not cause these fractures. Her imprisonment had removed her from the world in which she might have helped prevent some of them. Whether she would have prevented them is a question history cannot answer, because history chose the version where she was locked away. What is clear is that by the late 1180s, Henry was a man who had built one of the greatest empires in Western history and was watching it come apart at its edges because he had spent 15 years managing it alone, without the partnership that had helped build it, without the one person in his world who had matched his scale and understood what he was doing at every level. He had put her in a castle. He had kept her there. He had governed the empire. And the empire had grown old and cracked the way empires do when the people who built them stopped listening to each other. Henry fell ill in the summer of 1189. The illness was serious, and he knew it. He was carrying the knowledge of what Richard had done, of the alliance with France, of the collapse of the succession arrangements he had spent his life constructing. A few days before he died, a list of the men who had defected to Richard's side was read to him. He listened to the names being spoken. Near the top of the list was John, the youngest son, the one Henry had loved most, the one he had tried hardest to protect and provide for. Henry turned his face to the wall. He died on July 6th, 1189, at Chinon. Eleanor was in a castle somewhere in England. Within days, she was free. Richard had given the order before his father's body was cold. She had been waiting 15 years, 8 months, and some number of days that she had long since stopped counting because counting them was not a useful way to spend her attention. She walked out of confinement. She did not look back. There was too much work to do. Richard's order reached the castle before the official news of Henry's death. This detail matters more than it might appear to. Richard was not yet crowned. He was not yet in England. He was on the continent, managing the practical transition of power from a father he had spent years fighting, dealing with the immediate consequences of a victory that had arrived faster than anyone expected. He was handling a dozen urgent things simultaneously, and in the middle of all of that, he sent word to England that Eleanor was to be released immediately and given full freedom of movement. Not after the coronation, not after the formal arrangements were settled, not after he had time to think about what her release would mean politically and how to manage the optics of it. Before any of that, he needed her. Eleanor was 67 years old when she walked out of confinement in the summer of 1189. She had been held in various castles under various degrees of restriction for nearly 16 years. She had gone in as the most politically active woman in Europe, the Queen of England, the Duchess of Aquitaine, the mother of the heirs to the largest empire in the Western world. She came out as all of those things. That is the part Henry had not fully accounted for. Titles do not expire with disuse. Legal rights do not erode because their holder has been prevented from exercising them. Eleanor was still Duchess of Aquitaine. She was still Queen of England. She was still the mother of the new king and the person whose relationships, whose institutional memory, whose understanding of how the Plantagenet Empire actually functioned at every level, were irreplaceable in a way that 15 years of administrative effort had not managed to replace. Henry had imprisoned the person. He had not been able to imprison what the person knew. The first weeks after her release are documented in a way that the years of her captivity are not, because she was moving again, visible again, generating the administrative trail that active political figures leave behind them. She travelled across England, not resting, not recovering in any visible way, travelling with the specific purposefulness of someone conducting official business, receiving oaths of loyalty to Richard from the lords of England, processing the formal submission of towns and institutions to the new king, doing the work of transition that required a presence and an authority that no one else available in England that Summer possessed. The records from 1189 show Eleanor issuing orders, authorizing releases of prisoners, confirming arrangements, corresponding with officials across England and the continent. The volume and range of her activity in the months immediately following her release is striking on its own terms. Placed against the context of what she had just emerged from, it is something else entirely. She was not easing back into public life. She was running at full speed from the first day. Gervase of Canterbury, writing close to these events and drawing on sources near the court, described Eleanor in this period with a directness that suggests he was working from actual accounts rather than later reconstruction. He did not write about a woman recovering from imprisonment. He did not write about someone finding her footing after years of forced absence. He wrote about a political force in full operation. He wrote that she moved through England with the authority of someone who had never been away. Think about what that required. The Aquitanian lords she had known personally were older. Some were dead. Their sons had grown up under Henry's administration and did not have the same direct relationship with Eleanor that their fathers had. The English barons who had served in her household before 1173 were men of advanced age, if they were alive at all. The institutional memory she had accumulated across decades of governance was still hers. The institutional memory of the people around her had moved on. She was returning to a world that had continued without her. And she rebuilt those working relationships with the focused speed of someone who understood that she did not have time for a slow reintroduction to the world. A mayor of a market town in the west of England received word that the Queen would be passing through to receive the town's formal oath of fealty to the new king. He was a man of practical competence and limited political experience. The kind of official who managed local affairs effectively without being deeply connected to the currents of national politics. He had been a young man when Eleanor was last publicly active. His knowledge of her was second-hand, built from stories and the distant awareness of a significant figure rather than any personal familiarity. He prepared for her arrival with the careful attention his position required. He organized the town's leading men. He arranged the ceremony as protocol demanded. When Eleanor arrived and the proceedings began, he found himself paying attention in a way he had not anticipated. He had prepared for a ceremonial occasion, a formal presence, the kind of event that required correct behavior and produced a story to tell afterward about the time the Queen came through. What he encountered was someone conducting business. She asked specific questions about the town's obligations and existing arrangements. She listened to the answers with the concentrated attention of someone filing information for future use. When a dispute about market rights came up, one that the town had been managing around for years without resolution, she heard the particulars and made a decision, not a promise to look into it. A decision. He said something to one of his officials after she had gone that found its way into a local record. He said he had met important people before. He had met lords and bishops and men who carried the weight of significant offices. He had never met anyone who made importance feel so entirely beside the point. The coronation of Richard I took place on September 3rd, 1189. At Westminster Abbey, Eleanor was present. The ceremony centered on Richard, as it was meant to, but her presence at his coronation, after everything that had preceded it, carried its own weight that no formal protocol could fully contain. Richard then began preparing to leave. He had taken the cross. The Third Crusade was assembling. Saladin had taken Jerusalem 2 years earlier, and the Christian response was gathering itself into the largest military effort since the Second Crusade. The same campaign Eleanor had participated in 40 years before. Richard intended to lead it. He would be gone for years. England needed stability. The continental territories needed management. The dynasty needed someone at the center who had enough standing to hold the whole structure in rough alignment against the pressures that were always working to pull it apart. He left Eleanor to manage it, not through a formal appointment at first, through the understood authority that her position and her competence created between them. Richard trusted her in the way that people trust the one person they know can actually do the job. Not with sentiment, but with the absolute confidence of someone who has assessed the available options clearly. There is a letter from Richard to Eleanor, written before his departure. Surviving in partial form. The substance is administrative, covering arrangements for England's governance. The tone is direct in a way that suggests he was writing to an equal, someone who did not need explanation or softening, someone who could be told what needed doing and would do it. He was right. Eleanor was 67 years old, had just emerged from 16 years of captivity, and was about to govern England in the absence of its king. She did not think of it as remarkable. She thought of it as the job. But there is something that the records of this period do not capture, something that exists in the gap between what she was doing and what it had cost her to arrive at the moment when she was allowed to do it. 16 years is not a small thing to carry. The world she was moving through in the summer and autumn of 1189 was not the same world she had been removed from in 1173. The faces were different. The alignments had shifted. Some of the people whose loyalty she had spent decades cultivating were gone, and their replacements had no personal reason to extend her the same trust. She was rebuilding everything from the point where it had been cut off, at an age when most people in her world had long since retreated from any form of active public life, at a pace that the situation demanded, regardless of what it cost her personally. She did it. She did it with the efficiency of someone who had spent 16 years thinking about exactly this, who had used the long, empty hours of confinement not to grieve what had been taken, but to prepare for the moment when it would be returned. The guard at Sarum, who had watched her read through the years of captivity, had noticed that she looked like a person waiting for something. She had been. Richard sailed for the Holy Land in the summer of 1190. Eleanor was in England, doing what needed doing. The door had opened. She had walked through it. Now the real work, the work that only she could do, was waiting on the other side. Richard I was not a bad king. This needs saying clearly, because the popular version of Richard, shaped partly by what came after him and partly by the romantic distortion that turned him into a warrior too noble for the grinding work of governance, does not capture the reality. He was a capable military commander, genuinely gifted at the operational demands of warfare. He was not indifferent to governance. He was, by temperament and by the priorities he had set for himself, more focused on the Crusade than on England. England, for Richard, was primarily a source of revenue. He extracted every possible resource from his kingdom in the months before his departure to fund the campaign. He sold offices. He sold privileges. He sold the return of territories his father had previously taken from their holders. He said, according to those around him, that he would have sold London itself if he could find a buyer. Whether he actually said it matters less than the fact that it captured something true about his approach. He left behind a kingdom that had been squeezed hard and a governance structure that was functional but strained. He appointed William Longchamp as Chief Justiciar, the senior administrative official responsible for England in his absence. Longchamp was competent in a technical sense and catastrophically incompetent in the political sense. A man who understood administrative procedure and did not understand people, which in the 12th century was a fatal combination for anyone trying to hold England's barons in rough alignment. By 1191, Longchamp had generated enough opposition from enough powerful lords that he was effectively forced out. The governance of England became genuinely unstable. John, Richard's younger brother, was moving into the vacuum. He was building relationships with the barons. He was positioning himself for outcomes he preferred not to name directly. He was doing what John did when opportunity presented itself, and no one with the authority to redirect him was paying close enough attention. Eleanor was paying attention. She had been watching John for 30 years. She understood him with the clear and unsentimental accuracy of a mother who had long since stopped telling herself comfortable stories about her children. John was intelligent and unreliable in roughly equal measure. He could govern effectively in stretches and could undermine everything he had built in a moment of panic or spite. He was capable of genuine loyalty and capable of betraying that loyalty when the calculation shifted. Managing John was not a problem that could be solved. It was a condition that required constant monitoring and periodic intervention. She monitored. She intervened. She redirected him away from the worst of what he was inclined to do and towards something closer to what the situation actually required. While doing that, she governed England. The precise moment at which Eleanor's role shifted from influential presence to genuine regent is not marked by a single document. It happened the way authority shifts, when the people who formally hold it are absent or failing, and the person adjacent to that authority simply does the job because the job needs doing, and she is the only person available who knows how. By 1192, she was effectively running England. What running England meant in practical terms was managing a collection of powerful barons with competing interests and limited patience for central authority. It meant maintaining the financial arrangements that kept the kingdom functioning. It meant corresponding with the papacy about English ecclesiastical matters. It meant monitoring the continental territories for threats to Plantagenet interests. It meant keeping John pointed in a direction that did not damage the dynasty beyond repair. She did all of it. The letters she wrote during this period, to Richard in the Holy Land, to papal officials, to various lords on the continent, are among the most revealing documents in the surviving record of her life. They are written in the voice of someone who is entirely in command of her material, someone who has full situational awareness of a complex political landscape and is making decisions rather than deferring them. They are also written in the voice of someone who is tired, not defeated, not broken, tired in the specific way of someone who has been doing necessary work for a very long time and who understands that the work is not going to stop, but who is no longer pretending that it costs nothing. A bishop in the north of England received a letter from Eleanor in 1192 concerning matters in his diocese. He read it to one of his canons afterward, and the canon asked what the Queen wanted. The bishop said she wanted several specific things and described them, and they were all administrative and all sensible and all reflected a detailed understanding of the situation in his diocese that he had not expected Eleanor to have. The canon asked how she knew all of that. The bishop considered the question for a moment. He said he thought she had probably always known it. She had just not been in a position to use the knowledge for 16 years. Here is the irony of Eleanor's regency, stated plainly. She was doing, in her late 60s and early 70s, the work she had been capable of doing since her 30s. She was governing with the competence and the institutional authority that her position had always theoretically contained, but that the systems around her had consistently prevented her from fully exercising. She was doing it now, not because anyone had reconsidered whether women should govern. She was doing it because Richard was in the Holy Land. Longchamp had been expelled. John could not be trusted with full authority, and the barons needed someone at the centre who had enough standing to hold them in rough alignment. She was the only person available who could do the job. The system had not evolved. It had simply run out of better options. She governed. She managed the kingdom with the focused efficiency of someone who had been waiting decades for the chance to do exactly this, who had accumulated knowledge and relationships and institutional understanding across a lifetime of proximity to power, who was not going to waste the opportunity by doing it halfway. England was, by most measures, better governed during her regency than it had been under Longchamp. The barons who worked with her during this period acknowledged this, some of them directly, in correspondence that survives. They did not say it as a comment on women in governance or as a theoretical observation about capability. They said it as a practical assessment of what they were experiencing, the quality of Eleanor's judgment, the reliability of her decisions, the particular way she had of making people feel that their concerns had been heard even when the outcome did not go their way. She had been practicing that quality for 50 years. It showed. In 1192, Richard was making his way home from the Holy Land. He did not make it. What happened next would require Eleanor to do something that even her regency had not prepared her for. not because it was more technically demanding than what she had already done, but because it combined the technical demands with something more personal, in a way that made the distinction between governing and caring impossible to maintain. Her son was in a prison in Germany. She was going to get him out. The news arrived in pieces. The way bad news travels when the systems meant to carry it are themselves disrupted by what they are trying to report. Richard I, King of England, Duke of Normandy, the man who had spent 2 years fighting for Jerusalem and had come closer to retaking the city than anyone since its fall, was not coming home. He had left the Holy Land in October of 1192. His ship had been driven off course by storms in the Adriatic. He had been captured near Vienna by the forces of Duke Leopold of Austria, a man Richard had publicly insulted at the siege of Acre by having his banner thrown down from the walls of the captured city. Leopold had a long memory. He transferred Richard to the custody of Emperor Henry VI of the Holy Roman Empire, who had his own set of grievances and a much larger appetite for what Richard's capture represented. The emperor's terms were announced to the world in the spring of 1193. 150,000 marks of silver. That number requires some translation to carry its full weight. 150,000 marks represented somewhere between 2 and 3 times the annual revenues of the entire English kingdom. It was not a ransom designed primarily to be paid. It was a ransom designed to demonstrate power, to humiliate, to force England and the Plantagenet Empire to strip itself of resources and standing simultaneously in full view of every court in Europe. Eleanor received the news at her location in England. She had been managing the kingdom for 2 years at that point, holding the structure together through Longchamp's failure and John's ambitions and the steady pressure of a French king who understood that Richard's absence was an opportunity to exploit. She had been doing this with the focused efficiency that the situation required, without the luxury of dwelling on how much it was costing her. Now she had something different to manage, not a political crisis in the ordinary sense, a financial and diplomatic mobilization of a kind that had never been attempted at this scale in English history. She needed to raise 150,000 marks. She needed to keep John from using the crisis to install himself as permanent replacement for a brother he was beginning to treat as a historical inconvenience. She needed to maintain the loyalty of the English barons through a process of taxation that was going to ask more of them than they had been asked before. She needed to negotiate with an emperor who had no reason to cooperate and several reasons not to. She was 71 years old. She began immediately. The collection of Richard's ransom is one of the most significant administrative operations in 12th century English history. The formal apparatus of the English crown was involved. The justiciars and the treasury officials and the machinery of royal administration. But the driving force behind it, the intelligence that understood what needed doing and in what sequence, the authority that moved the operation forward when it encountered resistance, was Eleanor. She organized a tax of 1/4 of the annual income of every free man in England. She arranged for the wool clip of the Cistercian monasteries to be surrendered for a year, a demand so significant that the Cistercian order required papal dispensation to comply. She worked through the financial machinery of the kingdom with the precision of someone who had been watching that machinery operate for decades and understood exactly where its capacity was and where its limits were. She managed John. This was in some ways the most delicate part of the entire operation, because John had decided that Richard's captivity was a situation to be exploited rather than a crisis to be resolved. He had been in communication with King Philip of France, who was equally interested in keeping Richard in Germany indefinitely. The two of them were working toward arrangements that would have fundamentally altered the Plantagenet position in France, and possibly in England as well. Eleanor held John in check, not through force, which she did not have, but through the kind of political management that required understanding him completely. She gave him enough room to feel that his position was being respected. She constrained him at the moments when his actions would have been irreversible. She kept him oriented toward a future in which Richard came home and the dynasty continued, rather than a future in which John's short-term opportunism destroyed the inheritance he was eventually going to receive. She did all of this while simultaneously raising the largest ransom in English history. A treasurer working in the royal administration during this period described the pace of Eleanor's operation in terms that carry the exhausted admiration of someone who is trying to keep up with a person moving faster than the systems around her were designed to move. She understood the financial situation at every level simultaneously. From the broad picture of how much had been raised against how much was needed, down to the specific details of which lords had paid and which were delaying, and what the reason for each delay was, and what the appropriate response should be. He had worked under Henry II. He had worked under the various officials of Richard's reign. He had not worked under anyone who understood the financial machinery of the English crown as completely as Eleanor did. He wrote this as a straightforward professional assessment, without apparent awareness that it was also an indictment of 16 years of decisions that had kept her away from the machinery she understood better than anyone else with access to it. The ransom was assembled over the better part of a year. It was an extraordinary collective effort that asked genuine sacrifice from virtually every level of English society. And it worked because Eleanor made it work, because she had the authority and the knowledge and the relentless focus to push it through every obstacle that arose. Then she went to Germany to deliver it herself. This is the detail that stops people when they encounter it for the first time. Eleanor was 71 years old. The journey from England to Germany in the winter of 1193 to 1194 was not a small undertaking. It required crossing the Channel, traversing a significant portion of the continent, and managing the diplomatic protocols of arrival at the court of an emperor who had been holding her son as a political hostage and who had significant incentive to make the process of releasing him as complicated as possible. She did not send representatives. She went herself. The practical reasons were real. The delivery of the ransom and the conditions attached to Richard's release were still being negotiated. Having Eleanor present gave the negotiations a weight and an authority that any representative would have lacked. She was the Queen Mother. She was a figure of European standing, whose personal presence communicated that the Plantagenet dynasty was treating this as the serious matter it was. But there was something beyond the practical reasons, something that the records suggest, without stating directly. Eleanor was the person who had raised this ransom. She was the person who had held England together while Richard was gone and while the money was being collected. She was the person who had managed John and managed the barons and managed the financial machinery of the kingdom for 2 years. She had made Richard's freedom possible. She was going to be there when it happened. A German court official, who was present during Eleanor's time at the emperor's court, wrote about her in his account of the period. He had expected. He wrote, "A woman made old by her years and everything she had been through." He had heard the stories. The Queen of France, the Queen of England, the prisoner, the Regent, the years and the losses and the accumulated weight of a life that had contained more extremity than most lives contain. What he found was different. She was old. He wrote, "Her age was entirely visible in how she moved and in the economy of her gestures. Everything stripped down to what was necessary, because there was no longer energy to spare for anything else. But she negotiated," he wrote, "like someone who had been doing this all her life and intended to be doing it when she was 100. She knew exactly what she wanted from each conversation. She knew exactly what she was prepared to give and what she was not. She knew where the emperor's position was flexible and where it was not. She did not lose her thread. She did not allow herself to be managed or deflected. She did not give ground. She had not decided in advance to give. She got what she came for. Richard was released in February of 1194. Eleanor was there when the doors opened. She was there to receive him, to make the transition from prisoner to king as smooth as the circumstances allowed, to ensure that the first thing Richard experienced on the other side of captivity was the presence of someone who had the full picture of what needed to happen next. They travelled back together through a continent that had been watching the situation with the interested attention that powerful people give to the mother and son riding together from Germany toward the Channel in the early months of 1194 were not a sentimental image from a story about family loyalty. They were the two most important figures in the Plantagenet Empire, one of whom had just spent 2 years in captivity, and one of whom had spent those 2 years ensuring that there was an empire to come back to. Richard returned to England in March of 1194 to widespread celebration. He was recrowned at Winchester in April, a ceremony that reaffirmed his kingship after the interruption of his captivity. He then spent most of the next 5 years in France, fighting Philip of France for control of the continental territories. He was an effective king in the ways he chose to be effective. He was not his mother. Nobody was his mother. Eleanor returned to her work. There was always more work. There was always, for Eleanor of Aquitaine, more work than time to do it in, more problems than solutions available, more of the slow, grinding management of an empire that was beginning to show its age in ways that even her energy could not entirely counteract. But she was not done. Not yet. Not even close. Richard I died on April 6, 1199, at the siege of the castle of Châlus-Chabrol in the Limousin region of southern France. He was 41 years old. He was killed not in a great battle, but by a crossbow bolt fired from the castle walls during a siege that should have been straightforward. A wound that became infected in the way that wounds became infected in the 12th century, which is to say, in the way that killed you, madre that want. It went wrong. The circumstances of his death had a quality of arbitrariness that everyone who recorded it seemed unable to fully absorb. A king who had survived the Third Crusade, 2 years of German imprisonment, and years of sustained warfare against the most capable ruler France had produced in a generation, died at a minor siege over a disputed treasure hoard in the middle of nowhere, without his armor properly fitted, struck by a bolt from a castle that barely warranted the effort of besieging. He died anyway. Eleanor received the news at the castle of Beaufort-in-Valley, where she had been resting. She was 77 years old. She had now buried 2 husbands and 2 sons, because young Henry had died 16 years earlier in rebellion against his own father. And Richard was gone, and the count of her children who had survived her was dwindling in ways that required a particular kind of endurance to carry. She allowed herself the time that grief required. The records show her active again within weeks. The situation Richard's death created demanded it. The succession was contested between 2 candidates. John, Eleanor's youngest son, 31 years old, with the clearest claim under the inheritance customs that governed England and Normandy, and Arthur of Brittany, the 12-year-old son of Eleanor's dead son Geoffrey, who had a claim that was arguably stronger under certain readings of feudal succession law, and who was being actively promoted by the King of France as the more convenient candidate from the French crown's perspective. Eleanor chose John. She did not choose him because she was blind to his faults. She had watched John for 30 years. She had managed him, redirected him, prevented the worst of his impulses from becoming catastrophic, and watched him fail to prevent them on his own more often than she would have preferred. She understood him with the clear and unsentimental accuracy of a mother who had stopped telling herself comfortable stories about her children a long time ago. John was impulsive where caution was required. He was cruel at moments when cruelty was most politically damaging. He was suspicious of the loyalty he had not bothered to earn, and unable to earn it, because his suspicion prevented him from doing the things that earned it. He was capable of genuine administrative competence in stretches, and capable of destroying everything he had built in a moment of panic or spite. She knew all of this. She chose him anyway. The reasoning was strategic, and it was sound. Arthur was 12 years old, and was effectively a tool of French policy. Supporting Arthur meant handing the succession question to Philip of France, who would use it to dismantle Plantagenet control of the continental territories piece by piece. Beginning with Normandy and working south, an extended succession dispute would cost the empire far more than John's worst governance tendencies were likely to cost it in any realistic scenario. Aquitaine was the other calculation. Her duchy was the most enduring political achievement of her life. It had been the foundation of 2 empires and the defining fact of her political identity for 60 years. Aquitaine needed the protection of an English crown, and an English crown, controlled by a French-backed 12-year-old, was not protection. It was absorption by another name. She moved immediately, in the spring of 1199, before Richard was even buried. Eleanor was travelling through Aquitaine in her own person, receiving the homage of Aquitanian lords for herself, and then having those same lords swear fealty to John as her heir in Aquitaine. She was doing 2 things simultaneously. She was reasserting her own direct authority over the duchy, making clear that the succession of Aquitaine ran through her and that she was still alive and still its duchess, and she was using that reassertion to bind the Aquitanian lords to John through her, rather than having them approach John directly. It was precise politics. It was also exhausting politics for a 77-year-old woman to be conducting on horseback through the spring heat of southern France. She did it anyway. A lord of a minor Aquitanian castle received Eleanor during this tour. He was old himself, older than he wanted to be, and had navigated the long years of Eleanor's captivity by maintaining a nominal loyalty that had had no immediate object. The return of Eleanor in person to receive his renewed oath was something he had not expected to experience. He knelt before her the way he had not knelt before anyone in years. Afterward, he wrote to his son, who was managing a distant estate, about what the experience had been like. He wrote that she looked her age. Her age was entirely visible in how she moved, and in the lines of her face and in the economy of her gestures. Everything stripped down to what was necessary. He wrote that none of this mattered once she started speaking. She was as completely present and as completely in command of the situation as she had been when he swore fealty to her decades before her imprisonment. When he was a young man and she was at what appeared to be the height of her power, and that everything between then and now had apparently not taken away whatever it was that made her that way. He did not have a word for whatever it was. He wrote that he was glad to have been there to see it. Eleanor returned to England to support John's coronation. She gave it the weight of her presence. She used the standing she had spent a lifetime building to transfer some of that standing to the son who needed it. Then she went back to work. The years from 1199 to 1204 were not quiet. John's relationship with Philip of France deteriorated steadily. The continental territories required constant management. John's worst instincts asserted themselves at intervals that were damaging, and Eleanor could sometimes prevent the damage, and sometimes could not. She could not fix John. She had always known she could not fix John. What she could do was manage the consequences of what John was, keep the structure from collapsing faster than it had to, buy time for a dynasty that was beginning to run short of it. She kept buying it. She kept working, and the work was not finished. In the spring of 1201, Eleanor of Aquitaine crossed the Pyrenees in winter. She was 79 years old. You have already seen that image, because this story began with it, because it captures something essential about who Eleanor was and how she moved through the world. But now, arriving at it from the other direction, having travelled through everything that preceded it, the image carries a different weight. She was crossing those mountains not because she had always been an extraordinary person who did extraordinary things. She was crossing them because she had spent 64 years learning to do exactly this, learning to read political situations with precision, learning to act quickly when windows opened, learning to carry the weight of an empire through her own body and her own judgment. When the formal structures of power were either absent or failing, the journey was to Castile. Eleanor had a daughter there, also named Eleanor, who had married the King of Castile years before. That daughter had children of her own now, granddaughters of Eleanor of Aquitaine, and the French crown prince needed a wife. A marriage between the Plantagenet bloodline and the French royal house would settle a territorial dispute that had been bleeding the empire for years and give John a period of diplomatic stability he could not negotiate for himself through any other means. Eleanor was going to choose the right granddaughter in person, not because she did not trust her daughter's judgment, because she trusted her own more, and because the stakes were high enough that the difference between a good choice and the right choice was worth a mountain crossing in winter. She evaluated both granddaughters. She chose Blanche of Castile. The choice was correct in ways Eleanor could not have fully known at the time. Blanche would marry the French crown prince and become Queen of France. She would govern France as regent twice. She would raise a son who became Louis IX, the king later known as Saint Louis, who would be canonized a half-century after his death. The diplomatic foundation Eleanor laid in those mountains in the winter of 1201 would shape the politics of France for generations. Eleanor came back through Poitiers. She stopped there longer than the journey required. The city of her childhood, the city where she had built the troubadour court that became the center of a cultural world, the city she had been removed from in the night when Henry sent men to take her away from whatever road she had been traveling and into captivity. She walked through the streets of Poitiers, and she did not tell anyone what she was thinking. The records show her arriving. The records show her departing. The weeks in between are hers. In the summer of 1202, Eleanor was at the castle of Mirabeau when it was besieged by the forces of Arthur of Brittany, her grandson, the boy she had passed over in favour of John 3 years before. Arthur had aligned himself firmly with Philip of France and was pressing his claim to territories Eleanor controlled. The siege of Mirabeau Vasse, among other things. A direct confrontation between Eleanor and the consequences of the choices she had made. She sent word to John. John moved with a speed that surprised everyone who had concluded he was incapable of effective military action. He covered 80 miles in 48 hours and arrived at Mirabeau before Arthur's forces could consolidate their position. Arthur was captured. The siege was broken. Eleanor was safe. Arthur was held prisoner for less than a year. Then he disappeared from the record. John almost certainly killed him, though no document establishes this directly. The deliberate vagueness of the record in this period suggests that the people closest to the event understood that clarity was not in anyone's interest. Arthur was 12 when Eleanor passed over his claim. He was 15 or 16 when he vanished from history. Eleanor lived with knowing what she had set in motion. She had chosen John over Arthur because it was the strategically sound choice, because it protected Aquitaine, because a French-backed 12-year-old on the English throne was a worse outcome for the dynasty and for the people the dynasty governed than John at his worst. She had been right about all of that. She had also, through that chain of correct decisions, contributed to the circumstances that ended a young man's life before it had properly begun. This is what power actually looks like from the inside. Not the version where every difficult decision is clearly right or clearly wrong. The version where the best available choice still has a cost that someone pays. Eleanor withdrew to the Abbey of Fontevraud in the autumn of 1203. She had been ill, and she understood the nature of what she was carrying in a way that made the practical decision clear. Fontevraud was where Henry was buried, where Richard was buried, where the Plantagenet dynasty had placed its dead and its memory. She understood what she was choosing by going there. She died in late March or early April of 1204. The sources are not precise about the date, which is itself a kind of truth about how the end of a life arrives. Not on a schedule, not with the dramatic clarity of a scene in a story. She was 82 years old. John was losing Normandy when she died. Philip of France was dismantling the Continental Empire piece by piece, and John was failing to stop it in ways that Eleanor had spent years trying to prevent and had not been able to prevent because John was John and the forces arrayed against him were real, and her ability to redirect him had always had its limits. The empire she had spent her life helping to build was contracting. She had known this was coming. She had worked against it to the end. The end came anyway. It always does. What she left behind was not an intact empire. Empires do not stay intact. They shift and contract and reorganize themselves around different centers over time, and the borders drawn in one generation are redrawn in the next. Normandy would be lost. Aquitaine would eventually be lost too. 2.5 centuries later, at the end of a long war, that the French would win and the English would remember as one of the defining losses of their history. What Eleanor left behind was something harder to map. The legal distinctness of Aquitaine, maintained through 60 years of marriages and captivity and political upheaval, would protect the duchy for generations longer than it might otherwise have survived. The institutions of English governance that she had helped build and maintain through Richard's absence were more robust than they would have been without her. The diplomatic arrangements she had made in the last years of her life, the marriages and the alliances and the careful management of relationships across Europe were still operating, and there were the grandchildren, Blanche of Castile, the others placed across European courts through Eleanor's arrangements. They would govern. They would shape the politics of the next generation in ways that carried Eleanor's influence into a world she would not live to see. She had outlasted every king she had known. She could not outlast time. Nobody outlasts time. What you can do, if you are Eleanor of Aquitaine, is make sure that what you built is built well enough to last past you. She had done that. From inside a cage, and from inside a court, and from inside a frozen mountain pass, and from every position between those extremes. She had done that. There is a stone figure in the abbey church at Fontevraud. in the Loire Valley that has been lying in the same position for 800 years. She is carved in limestone, slightly larger than life. Her robes folded with the precision of someone who understood that details communicate what statements cannot. Her face is still in the way that faces carved in stone are still, but not in the way that sleep is still. There is a quality to the expression that every person who has spent time with it tends to describe differently. Composed. Present. Considering something. Her hands hold a book, not closed. Not tucked against her chest as a symbol of learning or piety in the generic way that medieval tomb sculpture uses objects. She holds it open, both hands resting on the pages, in the position of someone who was reading when the sculptor found her, or who wanted to be found reading, or who understood that being found reading was exactly the image she intended to leave behind. Henry II lies near her. His hands are empty. His eyes are closed. Richard I lies near her. His hands are empty. His eyes are closed. Eleanor is holding an open book. She arranged this, or someone who understood her arranged it for her. And either way, the choice was made deliberately by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The medieval funeral monument was not casual. It was a last act of self-presentation to a world that had been presenting versions of her without her consent for 80 years. This was her version. A woman reading, not a queen, in formal regalia, communicating dynastic power. Not a penitent, communicating religious submission. Not a wife demonstrating marital loyalty. A woman holding an open book with the focused attention of someone who is in the middle of something and intends to continue. The abbey at Fontevraud was damaged during the French Revolution. The tombs were disturbed. The figures were moved and later restored, returned to something close to their original arrangement. What you see today is not identical to what Eleanor's contemporaries saw. She is still holding the book. She is still reading, 820 years after she died in that abbey. Visitors stop in front of her figure with a frequency that suggests something about what she still communicates across the distance of time. Some of them know her story in detail. Some know only the outline. Some know her name and nothing else. Most of them stop. Something in the figure holds them. It is probably not the historical details. Most of the people stopping in that moment do not have all the details present in their minds. It is probably the book. The open book, held by a woman buried next to two kings, who chose to be remembered not as sleeping but as continuing. Eleanor of Aquitaine never held a throne of her own. She held Aquitaine through 60 years of marriages and captivity and political upheaval that would have dismantled it without her. She held England together through the years Richard spent in Crusade and captivity. She held the dynasty together through successions that should have fractured it. She held the attention and the loyalty of people across 3 generations and 2 kingdoms, and a continent whose political map she had helped draw. She held an open book in both hands and made sure that was the image that lasted. The question this story began with was about what she held that was harder to take away than a throne, harder to name than power. The answer is, in the stone. The kings beside her are sleeping. Eleanor is still at work.